The bright lights of a Hollywood film set shone like tiny stars, but Morgan Freeman barely noticed them. He had been on countless sets, acted in legendary films, and heard many stories. But today, something felt different. As he sipped his tea, his deep, wise eyes scanned the room. That was when he heard it. Soft, almost like a whisper, coming from the corner. A janitor, dressed in a faded blue uniform, was scrubbing the floor, his voice low, telling a story to no one in particular. "I was 9 when I lost my mother," the janitor murmured. "She died cleaning houses for people who never even looked at her. She gave everything she had, but it was never enough." Freeman froze. Something about those words felt heavy. They carried pain, truth, and years of silence. The set was loud, crew members adjusting lights, cameras clicking, people laughing. Yet that single voice cut through it all. Freeman leaned closer. "And my father?" The janitor chuckled bitterly. "Well, he walked out before I could even say Dad." Morgan Freeman put his tea down. He had heard a million stories in Hollywood. But this was something different, and he couldn't ignore it. Freeman walked over, his footsteps careful, almost hesitant. The janitor, an older man with graying hair and tired eyes, didn't notice him at first. He kept scrubbing, lost in memories. "My mother," the man whispered. "She used to hum while she worked, said it kept her heart from breaking." He paused, gripping the mop tightly. "But the day she passed, I never heard music the same way again." Freeman cleared his throat gently. The janitor looked up and his eyes widened. "Mr. Freeman," he stammered, stepping back. I didn't know you were listening." The actor offered a small smile. "I was." Silence. The janitor swallowed hard. He looked embarrassed, as if his words weren't meant for ears like Morgan Freeman's. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't be." "No," Freeman interrupted, his voice soft but firm. "Please, continue." The janitor hesitated. Then, as if a dam had broken, he spoke. "I used to dream of being a teacher," he admitted, "but life had other plans. When my mother passed, I had to work, scrub floors, clean up after people. I told myself I'd go back to school one day, but days turned into years, and here I am." His voice cracked. "I'm just the man who cleans up after everyone else." Freeman's heart clenched. He had met powerful men, talented actors, and wealthy moguls, but he had never met a man with a story like this, and he knew he had to do something. Freeman took a deep breath. The entire set, once a blur of movement, now felt painfully still. He looked around. No one had been paying attention. The janitor's story was slipping into the air, unheard. Not anymore. "Excuse me," Freeman said loudly, his voice commanding yet calm. The chatter stopped. Heads turned. Even the director, a man known for his short temper, froze mid-sentence. When Morgan Freeman spoke, the world listened. "I want everyone to hear this," he said. The janitor's eyes widened. "No, sir, please. It's not important." Freeman met his gaze. "It is." Silence stretched over the set like a heavy blanket. "This man," Freeman gestured, "had dreams, just like all of us. But life took them away. Not because he wasn't smart, not because he wasn't strong, but because the world never gave him a chance." The janitor shifted uncomfortably, looking down. Freeman gently lifted his chin. "You matter," he said firmly, "more than you know." The room was deathly quiet. Some of the crew members glanced at each other, their eyes misty. A few swallowed hard. Even the toughest men on set seemed shaken. No one had expected this, and no one knew what Morgan Freeman was about to do next. For a long moment, the janitor, whose name was Thomas, just stood there. His hands trembled slightly, gripping the mop as if it were the only thing holding him up. The room was so quiet that the faint hum of the studio lights filled the space. No one had ever truly looked at him before. Not like this. Freeman took a deep breath. Thomas, tell me, what did you want to teach? The janitor swallowed. History, he whispered. I wanted to tell stories of those who never got to tell their own. A deep sadness washed over Freeman's face. He had spent his life narrating great stories, yet right here was a man whose own story had been ignored. A young crew member wiped his eyes quickly. An assistant director shifted uncomfortably. No one had expected to feel like this today. Freeman reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp handkerchief, and handed it to Thomas. The older man hesitated, then took it with shaky fingers. And right there, before a room full of strangers, a janitor wiped away his silent tears. No one knew what Freeman was about to do next, but whatever it was, it would change everything. Freeman slowly walked toward the director's chair. Every step felt heavy, as if he was carrying the weight of Thomas's untold story. He turned back to the janitor. How long have you been here, Thomas? Thomas exhaled, glancing down. 32 years. His voice cracked. I've cleaned up after actors, after producers, and after people who never even learned my name. A low murmur rippled through the crew. 32 years. Freeman nodded thoughtfully, his wise eyes scanning the room. And no one ever asked? Thomas chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Why would they? A heavy silence followed. Some of the crew looked at the floor, guilt creeping into their hearts. How many times had they walked past Thomas without seeing him? How many times had he gone unnoticed? Freeman turned to the director. I have an idea, he said simply. The director, a sharp but kind-hearted man, raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Freeman's next words sent a shockwave through the set. I want Thomas to tell his story, not just to me, but to the world. Gasps filled the room. Thomas's eyes widened. Mr. Freeman, no, I'm just a janitor. Freeman smiled softly. No, Thomas, you're a storyteller. The director leaned forward in his chair, rubbing his chin. You're serious? Freeman nodded. Dead serious. Thomas shook his head. No, sir. This isn't... I don't belong in front of cameras. Freeman stepped closer. And why not? Thomas opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. The room was watching. The lights, once harsh and blinding, now felt warm. The cameras, once focused on actors, were now capturing something real. Freeman continued. You said you wanted to be a teacher, right? Well, teaching isn't just about classrooms. It's about sharing wisdom, telling stories that matter. Tears welled in Thomas's eyes. No one had ever spoken to him like this. Freeman turned to the director. We make movies about superheroes, about warriors, about legends. He paused. Why not make one about a man who never gave up? The director let out a slow breath. He looked at Thomas, then back at Freeman, and then to everyone's shock he nodded. Let's do it. A stunned silence filled the room. Thomas blinked rapidly. Wait, you mean me? In a movie? Freeman grinned. Yes, Thomas. You. For the first time in 32 years, Thomas felt seen. And for the first time in Hollywood history, a janitor was about to become something more. Thomas stood frozen, his breath shallow. The words still rang in his ears. A movie? About me? The room waited, eyes filled with shock, curiosity, and something else. Hope. The janitor, who had spent years being invisible, was suddenly the center of attention. But instead of excitement, fear gripped his chest. No, I can't, Thomas whispered, shaking his head. I don't belong in the spotlight. Freeman's deep voice softened. Thomas, do you think I was born in the spotlight? He chuckled. I worked as a clerk, a delivery man, even a mechanic. And I didn't get my first big role until I was past 40. Thomas looked up, his eyes filled with disbelief. But I'm not you, Mr. Freeman, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm just a janitor. Freeman took a step closer. No, Thomas. You are a man with a story. And stories, real stories, change the world. A tear slipped down Thomas's cheek. For the first time in his life, someone believed in him, and that terrified him more than anything. The crew slowly went back to work, but whispers filled the air. Everyone was still shaken. Freeman and Thomas sat on an old wooden bench outside the set. The Hollywood sun was bright, but Thomas's face was filled with shadows. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. Freeman smiled. You don't have to. You just have to be you. Thomas swallowed hard. I haven't told anyone my full story before. Freeman leaned forward. Then start now. A long pause. Then, with a deep breath, Thomas spoke. I was 12 when my father left, he began. My mother. She worked 3 jobs just to keep us fed. She never complained, not once. His voice cracked. But I could see it. The tired eyes. The aching hands. The nights she skipped dinner so I could eat. Freeman's face softened. One day I came home from school and she was sitting on the couch and staring at nothing. Thomas's hands trembled. I shook her, called her name, but she was already gone. A lump formed in Freeman's throat. I had no family, no home, so I worked, cleaned floors, scrubbed toilets. Thomas exhaled. 32 years later, I'm still here. Freeman's voice was thick with emotion. And after all that, you still never gave up. Thomas nodded, wiping his eyes. Because she wouldn't have wanted me to. Freeman looked at him, his eyes glistening. That's why the world needs your story, Thomas. That night, Thomas lay awake in his tiny apartment. He stared at the cracked ceiling, Freeman's words echoing in his mind. The world needs your story. For years he had buried it. Who would care? Who would listen? But something had changed today. Someone had listened. And that felt different. The next morning, Thomas arrived on set, gripping his mop as usual. But this time people looked at him differently. Some nodded, some smiled. It felt strange, almost warm. Then, a deep voice behind him. Are you ready? Thomas turned. Morgan Freeman stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes filled with quiet encouragement. Thomas inhaled sharply. Was he ready? No. But for the first time in his life, he wanted to try. He swallowed hard and nodded. And just like that, the janitor's story was about to begin. Thomas sat stiffly in a chair in front of the cameras. His calloused hands rested on his lap. He had spent years using those hands to clean up after others. Now, for the first time, they were still. The lights were bright. The crew stood quietly, waiting. No one was rushing. No one was shouting. The energy was different today. Morgan Freeman sat across from Thomas, calm and patient. He smiled warmly. When you're ready, Freeman said. Thomas inhaled deeply. His throat felt dry. His heart pounded. But then, he thought of his mother. He thought of the nights she worked late, humming softly as she scrubbed floors. He thought of how she would have wanted him to be strong. So he opened his mouth, and the story poured out. He spoke of hunger, of cold nights on the streets, of watching life pass him by while he scrubbed away footprints of those who never noticed him. He spoke of lost dreams, of broken promises. The crew listened. Not a single sound interrupted him. By the time he was done, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even Freeman, the man with the golden voice, was speechless. A deep silence filled the studio. Thomas wiped his face, suddenly embarrassed. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said so much. Freeman leaned forward. Never apologize for the truth. The director, who had been watching from the side, suddenly clapped his hands together. That's it, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. That's the story. Thomas frowned. What do you mean? Freeman turned to him. We don't need to make a movie. You just made it yourself. The janitor looked confused. Freeman gestured at the cameras. "We filmed everything." Thomas's breath caught in his throat. The director nodded. "We're not writing a script. We're not hiring actors. We're showing the world your real story, as it is." Thomas gripped the chair. But who would care?" Freeman's voice was steady. "Millions." Thomas shook his head, overwhelmed. Freeman smiled softly. "You've spent your whole life cleaning up after other people's stories. It's time the world listens to yours." For the first time, Thomas wasn't invisible anymore, and that scared him more than anything. The footage was raw, unscripted. Every word Thomas had spoken, every tear he had wiped away, was captured exactly as it happened. The director uploaded a short clip online that same night. No fancy edits, no Hollywood polish, just a man telling his truth. By morning, the world had changed. Thousands of comments flooded in. "This broke me. I haven't cried like this in years. We walk past people like Thomas every day, never again. Someone get this man the respect he deserves." The video had gone viral. By noon, celebrities were sharing it. Reporters were calling. TV networks wanted interviews. And Thomas? He was sitting in his tiny apartment, staring at his old flip phone as it vibrated non-stop. His hands trembled as he answered. "Mr. Freeman?" he stuttered. Freeman's voice was warm. "Are you ready for what's next, Thomas?" Thomas swallowed hard. He had no idea what was coming, but for the first time in his life, he was ready to find out. Thomas barely slept. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. He had ignored most calls, too overwhelmed to answer. He was just a janitor. Why did the world suddenly care? By noon, he finally turned on the television, and what he saw nearly made his heart stop. His face, his voice, his story, broadcasted on every major news channel. Morgan Freeman sat across from a news anchor, speaking calmly. "This is not just one man's story," Freeman said, his voice steady and powerful. "This is the story of forgotten people, hard-working people who go unnoticed, but not anymore." Thomas's hands trembled. People cared. They truly cared. The news anchor nodded. "People want to help. Donations have already started coming in." Thomas gasped. Donations? The camera cut to a news report. Over $500,000 raised overnight for Thomas Green, a janitor who spent 32 years cleaning floors and sacrificing his dreams. Thomas covered his mouth. Tears welled up. He had spent his whole life surviving. Now, for the first time, people wanted to lift him up. And that broke him. The next day, Morgan Freeman knocked on Thomas's door. Thomas opened it, eyes red from crying. Freeman smiled warmly. "May I come in?" Thomas nodded, stepping aside. Freeman looked around the tiny apartment. The walls were bare, the furniture old, the space too small for a man with such a big heart. Freeman sat down. "Thomas, there's something I need to ask you." Thomas swallowed. "Sir, Freeman held up a hand. "I know you never asked for any of this, but I need to know. What do you want?" Thomas blinked. "What do I want?" Freeman nodded. "You've spent years taking care of others, working, struggling, but if you could choose anything at all, what would it be?" Thomas felt his throat tighten. He had never been asked that before, not once. He looked down, hands shaking. Then in a whisper he said, "I want to teach." Freeman's eyes softened. "Then let's make it happen." Thomas frowned. "But Freeman leaned forward. "Thomas, would you trust me?" And for the first time in his life, Thomas did. 1 week later, Thomas stood in front of thousands. The stage was massive. The audience, even bigger. Reporters, celebrities, everyday people who had been moved by his story. Thomas gripped the podium, his knees weak. Freeman stood beside him. "You don't have to be perfect, Thomas. Just speak from the heart." Thomas exhaled. Then, slowly, he spoke. "I never thought I mattered. silence. I spent my life cleaning floors, wiping away footprints of people who never knew I existed. The crowd listened, eyes filled with tears. But Morgan Freeman, he listened. He reminded me that every person has a story worth telling, even people like me. A woman in the front row sobbed into her hands. "I want to tell you all something," Thomas continued, voice shaking. "There are millions like me, people who work hard, who sacrifice, who dream. Please, don't let them go unseen." A long pause. Then, thunderous applause. People stood. Tears fell. The world had changed that day. And in that moment, Thomas finally understood. He was never just a janitor. He was a voice that could move mountains. A week after his speech, Thomas sat in his tiny apartment, staring at his hands. His story had moved millions. People recognized him on the streets. Strangers stopped him just to say, "Thank you for speaking." But deep inside, he still felt like the janitor who had spent decades in the shadows. Then, his phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. "Hello?" His voice was hesitant. "Thomas Green?" The voice was smooth, familiar. "Yes, sir. This is President Joe Biden." Thomas almost dropped the phone. His chest tightened. I'm sorry, what?" A chuckle. "Son, I watched your speech. The whole country did. And we need more people like you. Would you be willing to visit the White House?" Tears burned his eyes. The President of the United States had just called him. His hands trembled as he whispered, "Yes, sir. I'd be honored." Morgan Freeman stood by the door, listening. He smiled, nodding proudly. Thomas wasn't just telling his story anymore. He was changing the world. The White House was massive, intimidating. Thomas had spent years cleaning floors, but never had he imagined walking through the doors of the most powerful building in America. He sat across from the president, hands folded tightly in his lap. "Thomas," Biden said warmly, "your story has touched millions. It reminds us why we must never forget the people who build this country, the workers, the dreamers." Thomas swallowed hard. "Sir, I don't know what to say." Biden leaned forward. "Say what's in your heart." Thomas exhaled. "I just want people to be seen. I want janitors, cleaners, security guards, people like me, to know they matter." Biden nodded. "And they will. Because of you." Morgan Freeman, who had traveled with him, put a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "I told you, Thomas. Your story isn't small. It never was." Tears filled Thomas's eyes. For years he had felt invisible, but today the whole world was looking at him and listening. Months later, Thomas stood in front of a brand new building. It was big, beautiful, and right above the entrance in bold letters was a name: the Thomas Green Academy for Forgotten Voices. Morgan Freeman stood beside him, smiling. "A place for people like you, Thomas. A place where janitors, single mothers, and struggling workers can learn, grow, and dream again." Tears streamed down Thomas's face. I don't know how to thank you," he whispered. Freeman patted his back. "You already did, by never giving up." News crews gathered. People clapped. A crowd had formed. But Thomas ignored all of it. He closed his eyes, picturing his mother's tired hands, her soft hums as she worked. "We made it, Mama." He looked at the sky, tears falling freely. For the first time in his life, Thomas Green wasn't just the man who cleaned floors. He was the man who changed lives. Before you go, my friends, if this story touched your heart, if it made you cry, if it reminded you of someone special, please like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me in the comments, who is a person in your life that deserves to be seen? Let's make their voices heard. Subscribe now. Your voice matters, just like Thomas's.